August 20th, 1989. A Beverly Hills mansion becomes the scene of one of the most brutal murders investigators had ever seen. Jose and Kitty Menendez, shot multiple times at close range. No signs of forced entry, no clear suspects. Just two grieving sons telling police they had just discovered the bodies. But as the days pass, something doesn't sit right. Lavish spending, strange behavior, and a story that keeps shifting. Then, a confession. Not to detectives, but to a therapist. And suddenly, the question isn't who killed them, it's why. Tonight, we open a case filled with wealth, violence, and a truth still debated decades later. This is Unsaid Case Files, and this is the story of the Menendez brothers. Before the headlines, before the trial, before the word murder was ever attached to their names, there was the image of perfection. Lyle Menendez and Eric Menendez were raised in a world most people only dream about: money, status, opportunity. Their father, Jose Menendez, was the definition of success. A self-made immigrant who rose to become a powerful executive in the entertainment industry. He demanded excellence. Perfection wasn't encouraged, it was expected. Their mother, Kitty Menendez, was a former teacher who gave up her career to raise her sons. From the outside, they were a picture-perfect American family. Big homes, elite schools, a life in Beverly Hills that looked untouchable. But behind closed doors, that image began to fracture. Lyle, the older brother, was once seen as confident, even charismatic. But as he got older, cracks began to show. Academic trouble, behavioral issues. Eventually, he was suspended from Princeton. Eric, quieter, more withdrawn. He found an outlet in tennis, even rising to a national ranking as a junior player. But those closest to him noticed something else: a constant pressure, an anxiety that never seemed to go away. And then there were the burglaries. In 1988, the brothers committed a series of break-ins in their own neighborhood, stealing cash and jewelry worth over $100,000. Not out of survival, but out of something harder to explain: rebellion, desperation, or something deeper. Their parents responded by tightening control. More rules, more pressure, more expectation. To the outside world, nothing had changed. But inside the Menendez home, tension was building. Because years later, after the murders, Lyle and Eric would claim something shocking: that their childhood wasn't privileged, it was abusive. Emotionally, physically, and, they said, sexually. Allegations that would divide a nation. Were they victims, acting out of fear? Or were those claims a carefully constructed defense? Because just 1 year later, everything would explode in a way no one could ignore. August 20th, 1989. A quiet Sunday night in Beverly Hills. Inside the Menendez mansion, Jose Menendez and Kitty Menendez sat together in the den watching a movie. It was ordinary, routine, until it wasn't. At some point that evening, their sons, Lyle Menendez and Eric Menendez, entered the room. They were carrying shotguns. What happened next was fast, violent, and relentless. Jose was shot multiple times. The blasts were devastating. One to the back of his head, nearly unrecognizable. Kitty didn't die immediately. She tried to crawl away, injured, bleeding, still alive. But the shooting didn't stop. She was shot again and again until there was no movement left. Investigators would later describe the scene as one of the most brutal they had ever encountered. Blood, destruction, chaos in a room that had been calm just minutes before. And then, silence. But the story doesn't end there, because after the murders, the killers didn't flee into the night. They stayed. For several minutes, the brothers remained inside the house, waiting, listening, expecting sirens that never came. Then, they left. They drove off, disposing of their blood-stained clothes and the weapons, trying to erase what had just happened. They even attempted to create an alibi, stopping at a movie theater, considering buying tickets to make it look like they'd been out all evening. But that plan fell apart. So instead, they went to a local event, blending in, acting normal, as if nothing had happened. Hours later, they returned home, and that's when the performance began. Lyle picked up the phone, dialed 911, his voice shaking, panicked. "My parents! Someone killed my parents!" In the background, Eric could be heard screaming, crying. Two sons discovering a nightmare. Or at least, that's what they wanted everyone to believe. Because in that moment, no one knew the truth. But the truth was already sitting inside that house, waiting to be uncovered. At first, the story made sense. A wealthy executive with powerful connections. A brutal double murder. No signs of forced entry. Investigators considered the possibility of a mob hit. It fit the image. It fit the violence. And standing at the center of it all, two grieving sons. Lyle Menendez and Eric Menendez appeared devastated, crying, shaking, telling police they had just come home to find their parents dead. But as days turned into weeks, something began to feel off. The grief didn't look like grief. It looked like freedom. The brothers started spending, and not just a little. Luxury watches, designer clothes, expensive dinners, a Porsche, even business investments. In just a few months, nearly $700,000 was gone. Money flowing fast, from insurance payouts and their father's estate. To investigators, it raised a dangerous question. Were they mourning or celebrating? Still, suspicion isn't proof. There was no direct evidence tying them to the crime. No witnesses, no confession. until one conversation changed everything. Eric had been seeing a psychologist, Jerome Oziel. Behind closed doors, in what he thought was a safe, confidential space, Eric told the truth. He admitted it. The murders. At first, it stayed hidden, locked inside therapy sessions. But secrets like that don't stay buried. Because soon, those conversations would be recorded. And when they surfaced, the entire narrative collapsed. Now, investigators weren't chasing a theory. They had something real, something powerful, a confession. And suddenly, the spotlight shifted from unknown killers to the sons who had been there all along, watching, waiting, and pretending. By early 1990, the illusion was gone. What once looked like a tragic mystery was now closing in on two very real suspects, Lyle Menendez and Eric Menendez. Behind the scenes, investigators had been building their case. The spending, the inconsistencies, the growing suspicion. But it was the recordings, the therapy sessions involving Jerome Oziel, that changed everything. Because now they didn't just have doubt. They had words, admissions, details, pieces of a truth the brothers had tried to hide. In March 1990, it all came crashing down. Lyle was arrested outside the Beverly Hills mansion, the same home where his parents had been killed. No dramatic chase, no resistance. Just the quiet end of a carefully maintained lie. Days later, Eric returned to Los Angeles from overseas. And instead of running, he turned himself in. Two brothers, now facing charges for the murder of their own parents. The media exploded. Headlines everywhere. A case that had already been shocking was now unimaginable. But the biggest twist? They didn't deny it. There would be no long search for the truth in court. No mystery about who pulled the trigger. Instead, their defense would shift the entire narrative. Because when the trial began, Lyle and Eric wouldn't claim innocence. They would claim something else. Something that would divide the country. They said they were victims, that the killings weren't cold-blooded. They were survival. Years of abuse, fear, control. And on that night, they said, they believed they were going to die. So they acted first. It was a claim that would shock the courtroom and force one haunting question. Were they calculating killers, or two sons pushed past the breaking point? Because now, the case wasn't just about what happened that night. It was about everything that came before it. When the trial began, the world was watching. Two brothers from Beverly Hills, accused of brutally murdering their parents. At first glance, it seemed simple. Money, greed, a planned execution for inheritance. That's what the prosecution argued. They painted Lyle Menendez and Eric Menendez as calculated, entitled, and desperate for control of their father's fortune. The evidence supported it. The shotgun purchases, the attempted alibi, the spending spree after the murders. And most importantly, the recordings. In taped sessions with psychologist Jerome Oziel, the brothers discussed the killings, at times even suggesting planning. To prosecutors, it was clear this was premeditated. But the defense told a completely different story. They didn't deny the killings. Instead, they reframed them. Not as murder, but as survival. According to the brothers, their father, Jose Menendez, was not just controlling, he was abusive. They described years of emotional torment, physical violence, and most shocking of all, sexual abuse. They claimed it started when they were children, and, in Eric's case, continued into adulthood. Their mother, Kitty Menendez, they said, knew about it, but did nothing to stop it, even enabled it. The courtroom shifted. This wasn't just a murder trial anymore. It became something else entirely. A battle of narratives. Were these two men lying, crafting a story to escape the death penalty? Or were they telling a truth, too disturbing for anyone to accept? The defense argued that on the night of the killings, everything reached a breaking point. The brothers believed their parents were going to kill them, to keep their secrets buried. And in that moment of fear, they acted. Not out of greed, but out of terror. It was a claim that stunned the nation and forced jurors and the public to confront an uncomfortable question. What if both things were true? Because now, the case wasn't just about evidence. It was about belief. The courtroom became a battleground, not just of facts, but of emotion, perception, and truth. On one side, the prosecution. On the other, two brothers telling a story many struggled to believe. Eric Menendez took the stand. For days, he spoke. Calm at times, broken at others. He described a childhood filled with fear. He claimed his father, Jose Menendez, had abused him for years, that the abuse didn't stop when he got older, that it continued right up until the murders. The courtroom listened, some in silence, some in disbelief. Then came the details, uncomfortable, graphic, difficult to hear. The defense wanted the jury to feel it, to understand the fear, to see the brothers not as killers, but as victims. Witnesses were called, family members, experts, psychologists. Some supported the claims, describing signs of trauma, control, and dysfunction inside the home. But the prosecution pushed back hard. They pointed out inconsistencies. Why was there no mention of abuse earlier? Why did the brothers plan the murders? Why reload and continue shooting? They argued this wasn't fear. It was overkill, calculated, deliberate. And then came one of the most damaging pieces of evidence. The tapes. Recordings from sessions with Jerome Oziel. In them, the brothers talked about the killings, but not about abuse, not about fear. Instead, they spoke about anger, control, and at times, even justification. To the prosecution, it was everything they needed. Proof that the story of abuse came later, built as a defense, not as a truth. But still, the jury was divided, because the defense had planted something powerful: doubt. And not just about the crime, but about what kind of family the Menendez home really was. Because if even part of what the brothers said was true, then this case was far more complicated than anyone expected. As the trial stretched on, one thing became clear. This case wasn't just dividing the courtroom, it was dividing everyone: the media, the public, and most importantly, the jury. Two completely different stories had been laid out. The prosecution's version: Lyle Menendez and Eric Menendez were greedy, entitled, and angry. They wanted money, freedom, control. So they planned it, bought the weapons, created an alibi, and carried out the murders. Then tried to act like victims. But the defense told another story, a story of fear, of years spent under the control of Jose Menendez, a house where, they claimed, abuse was hidden behind wealth and status, where silence was enforced, and where, on that final night, they believed their lives were in danger. Two narratives, both powerful, both disturbing. And now, it was up to the jury to decide which one was real. Deliberations began. Days turned into weeks. Inside the jury room, tension grew, because even there, the divide was undeniable. Some jurors believed the brothers. They saw vulnerability, fear, pain. They questioned whether the killings were truly premeditated. Others weren't convinced. They saw manipulation, inconsistencies, a story that didn't add up. They focused on the brutality, the number of shots, the reloading, the actions after the crime. To them, this wasn't self-defense. It was execution. And then the decision came, or rather, the lack of one. The jury couldn't agree. Deadlocked. A mistrial. No verdict. No closure. Just more questions. And a case that refused to be resolved. But this wasn't the end, because prosecutors weren't done. There would be another trial. Another chance to convince a new jury. And this time, things would be different. Because the next courtroom wouldn't just hear the story, it would reshape it. After the mistrial, everything changed. Prosecutors weren't willing to let this case end in uncertainty. They prepared for a second trial, but this time, the rules would be different. The courtroom would be quieter, more controlled. No cameras, less media frenzy. And most importantly, limits. The defense, which had relied heavily on emotional testimony and abuse claims, was now restricted in what they could present. Fewer witnesses, less detail, less room to tell the full story they had told before. For Lyle Menendez and Eric Menendez, that shift mattered, because their entire defense depended on one thing: convincing the jury they were afraid. But now, that narrative was harder to fully lay out. The prosecution, on the other hand, came in sharper, more focused. They doubled down on motive, money, control, premeditation. They walked the jury through the timeline again, the gun purchases, the planning, the execution-style killings, and the aftermath, the spending spree, the lies, the attempts to cover their tracks. This wasn't panic, they argued. This was calculated, deliberate. And this time, the defense made a critical decision. Lyle Menendez did not take the stand. Only Eric testified, alone, telling his version of events, again describing years of alleged abuse. But without the same level of supporting testimony, the impact wasn't the same. And the prosecution seized on that. They challenged his credibility, pressed him on inconsistencies, asked the question that lingered in everyone's mind. If you were truly afraid for your life, why plan? Why reload? Why continue shooting? The emotional weight of the first trial shifted, and in its place came something colder, more clinical, more focused on facts than feelings. When deliberations began this time, there was less division, less uncertainty, because the second jury wasn't just hearing a story. They were being guided toward a conclusion, and soon they would reach it. A verdict that would define this case forever. This time, there would be no deadlock, no uncertainty, no second guessing. After the second trial, the jury deliberated and reached a decision. Lyle Menendez and Eric Menendez were found guilty. 2 counts of first-degree murder. The jury concluded the killings were not acts of fear, but acts of premeditation. Planned, intentional, deliberate. The defense's claims of abuse, while still discussed, were not enough to justify what happened that night. Not enough to outweigh the evidence, the brutality, the preparation, the aftermath. And with that verdict came the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. 2 brothers who once lived in luxury, now facing the rest of their lives behind bars. The courtroom was silent. No dramatic outburst, no final twist. Just the weight of a decision that would follow them forever. But even after the verdict, the case refused to rest. Because outside the courtroom, the debate continued. Some believed justice had been served, that the evidence was clear, that the brothers were exactly what the prosecution said they were. Others weren't so sure. They believed the abuse, believed the fear, believed that something inside that home had been deeply wrong, and that the justice system had failed to fully understand it. Appeals followed. Arguments continued. Years passed, but the question never disappeared. Were Lyle and Eric cold-blooded killers, or victims who went too far? Because for many, the verdict answered the law, but it didn't answer the truth. Years passed, but this case never faded. It stayed alive in documentaries, interviews, and endless debate. Because the story of Lyle Menendez and Eric Menendez didn't end with their conviction. It evolved. From inside prison, both brothers continued to fight. Appeals, petitions, requests for new hearings, all centered around one claim: that the full truth had never been heard. Over time, new attention began to build. Generations who hadn't lived through the trial started asking new questions, looking at the case through a different lens. Not just what happened, but why. Allegations of abuse, once dismissed by many, began to resurface in public conversation. Some experts argued the case had been misunderstood, that trauma, fear, and long-term control may have played a bigger role than originally believed. Others strongly disagreed, pointing back to the evidence, the planning, the execution, the actions after the killings. And then, decades later, a major shift. In 2025, the brothers were resentenced from life without parole to 50 years to life, meaning, for the first time, they became eligible for parole. It was a decision that reignited everything. Supporters saw it as progress, a recognition that the case wasn't as simple as it once seemed. Critics saw it differently, arguing that nothing could justify the violence of that night. And when parole hearings came, both brothers were denied. For now. But the door is no longer closed. They will have another chance, and the debate continues, because this case was never just about two murders. It was about family, power, control, and the thin line between victim and perpetrator. Even today, people are still asking, if you believe you're trapped, if you believe your life is in danger, how far can you go before you become the very thing you fear? And that question is why this case will never truly be over. Some cases end with a verdict. This one didn't. Because even now, decades later, the story of Lyle Menendez and Eric Menendez still divides people. Two brothers, two victims, one night that changed everything, and a truth that may never fully be agreed on. So we leave you with this. Was it calculated murder, or a desperate act born from years of silence? Let us know what you think. If you want more cases like this, follow Unsaid Case Files on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode. It helps more people discover the stories that don't always get fully told. And if there's a case you think we should cover, drop it in the comments. Because the most chilling stories are often the ones still unanswered. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and remember, some truths are never fully spoken.